Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening. This is a great pleasure to welcome you to this, the first of the 2013 Dean's Lectures here at the University of Melbourne, Melbourne School of Design. My name is Tom Cavan. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. And I'd like to begin, as I usually do, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri, and to pay respect to their elders and families, past and present. Through the Dean's Lecture series each year, we present a breadth of experience and perspectives from across the globe. Through this, we wish and seek to fuel debate and discussion here on the campus, but also in the city and in the state. So as attested, well, welcome then to this lecture, which is From Archigram to Crab, Nosing Forward by Sir Peter Cook. As attested by the considerable number of people who registered for this lecture within the first few hours of its announcement, I think Peter doesn't need much of an introduction. Everyone is here for a purpose. But if I can, in case you don't know, Professor Sir Peter Cook joins us from the UK, where he runs his architectural practice, Crab, together with Gavin Robotham. He's also a senior fellow of the Royal College of Art. He holds a professorship at the Royal Academy, at the University College London, and also in Frankfurt in Germany. In 2002, he and Archigram were awarded the Royal Gold Medal by the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. And in 2007, Peter was knighted by the Queen for his services to architecture and education, with Prince Charles presiding at the investiture. The power of architecture and design is often debated. Today, we'll hear directly from a person who's made considerable impact, an impact that has emerged and developed over considerable time and has cemented itself in our assumptions and our practices, and if I can borrow a word, Peter, from our prejudices too. Without Archigram, would Paris have the Pompidou Center? Without Archigram, would Hong Kong Shanghai Bank be so readily accepted by the bankers? So in his early days of his career, Peter co-launched Archigram, a radical and, as many would describe it, a futuristic experimentalist group who produced a magazine with sketches and musings on the built environment and presented a wide range of installations and provocative ideas. Archigram challenged the architects to think outside their comfort zone and those who observed architecture. In fact, the name Archigram, of course, is a concatenation of the words architectural telegram, which is an urgent communication of great importance. So in this early work, the plug-in city or the walking city, what we see is an articulation of the modernist engagement with the industrial delivery, leavened by a post-war cynicism of tradition and enlivened by a 1960s exuberance of experience. Anything was possible. The future could be manufactured, and the senses tickled. A notable feature of this work, I think, is its plasticity. It's a plasticity of form, in representation, and also in its experimental presence. So the work sits very clearly, I think, as a marker in the trajectory of architectural development through the past 150 years, tracing a line along which we see such protagonists of urban innovation and process from the early 20th century, through Buckminster Fuller, who engaged industrial production in an inventive manner. So the flag is carried by others now, demonstrating the power of Archigram and its ideas. The flag still flies. And these ideas of the 1960s clearly drew much from the capacities of, for example, car manufacturing. The momentum of parametric design and the manufacturing today is presaged in Archigram's images in the 1960s, without which, that is the parametric design and manufacturing, it's not possible to realize these designs, just as it is not in the automotive world. So for the past 2 weeks, Peter has been teaching a masterclass here at the Melbourne School of Design with students thoroughly engaged and in partnership with the Victoria Department of Transport. An exhibition of their work opened earlier this evening just upstairs in the Yoshika Mirakoa Maya room. And please go in there and take a look before next Tuesday when the exhibition will be dismantled and removed. At the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, we're committed to creating rich opportunities for our students to engage with these global leaders across the full range of the built environment in masterclass settings. So this was the first in what we planned to be a series of exceptional international minds leading the masterclasses across our 6 professional programs and experimenting across the full range of how we conceive, deliver, and realize that built environment. So the Masterclass program enhances the learning environment, and as the exhibition upstairs attests, it provides direct access to the best international minds and engages in practice today here in Melbourne. Now, Peter will discuss his journey from Archigram to Crab and share with us the significant moments, projects that have shaped the career, discussing anti-cities and anti-houses and how experimentation morphs into buildables. So Peter, thank you. Please welcome Sir Peter Pope.
Good evening. When I went on the radio the other night, I asked for a piece of music by John Adams called A Short Ride on a Fast Machine, and I think this evening is going to be, should be using the same piece of music if we had any music. Could I have the lights down, please? Do they not come down? Are we going to have it lit? Obviously we are. Okay. I come from the seaside. You're in the seaside, but British seaside's a funny place because, as you know, the Poms are very kind of uptight, and it's only at the seaside that they let their trousers down. And I sold ice cream at the seaside, and I used to see all sorts of funny things. But what I'd earlier seen at a smaller seaside town was a strange picture, the one on the left, which has remained in my brain for a very, very long time, because at Felixstowe there was, in fact, a megastructure next to a piece of Art Deco with a piece of Expressionism underneath it. It was called the Helter Skelter, the Cafe, and the Crazy House, but that's actually what it was. I didn't realize at the time. And then when I moved to Bournemouth, I became familiar with a thing called the cliff lift. You paid a penny if you were very lazy to go down the cliff, and if you were less lazy, you paid a penny to go up the cliff. It was, in fact, technology folded into the normal scene. One didn't have to say there was technology in something else. But it's a very strange place, Bournemouth, where I first went to architecture school. It was the last place in the UK still doing the École des Beaux-Arts curriculum. We had to learn from James Gibbs rules for drawing the several parts of architecture. We had to measure churches with bits of lead. We had to draw from Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament from the 19th century. We had to do 9 shades of wash when doing an axonometric of Hagia Sophia. How I hated Hagia Sophia for many decades. It's also a beach town. It's also a repository of some of the best neo-Gothic architecture in England. And it reminds, there's a lot of Melbourne in Bournemouth. So the diligent student had to read this stuff, had to follow the rules, and developed a kind of love-hate for it. Because in fact, and I went there at the age of 16, but from 14, I'd been reading about architecture, not that sort of architecture. There is, of course, an aspect of Bournemouth that still resides in me, which was this notion of Arcadia, the notion of the gentle boardwalk and things in amongst the trees, and silly things in amongst the trees sometimes. But what I had been reading about before I went to that funny school was stuff like this. I discovered this, I think, at the age of 15. And I thought, bloody hell, it's not like anything I've ever seen. It's like a biplane. It's like a kite. It's a wonderful, what? And then I was doing all this funny stonework. Very strange. Well, I went to London. I started buying leather jackets and doing funny drawings. And I'd been to the Architectural Association. And in such a city, you come across all sorts of people. And we did the Archigram, the architectural gram, as Thomas so correctly said, deliberately making each copy different, deliberately bringing in all sorts of friends, some of which we didn't know, some of which even, I remember my meeting with Hans Hollein was because I'd cut a drawing of his out of an obscure magazine called Bow and glued it in. And instead of him going up the wall, he sent me a letter saying, I'm Hans Hollein, whose picture you glued in your magazine, let's meet. We did pop-up magazines. We did things where, you did, instead of the old sort of serious thing, don't architects take themselves so serious. Instead of the old serious thing, we've done this design, therefore it's got to be read. He said, pops up! Why not? Send your own stuff up. Nobody else is going to not let you. And we were a I would say in summary, we were a kind of coalition of very individual minds. We were almost even in competition. It's rather like a very, very good school studio where you sort of, okay, fuck it, I'll go home and do something more, you know? And believe it or not, we were subsidized for a long time by a famous company, Taylor Woodrow, of building constructors. They didn't quite know what they'd got, and they paid for this model to be made. How about that? This is your day job project. And of course, the other thing is the relationship between one's work and then one came to teach after doing about 2 years as a rather stroppy juror, as some of you in the room will know this experience. And in fact, taken on to teach, I had never had the luxury of anonymity, because in fact, the Plug-in City had been published in the Sunday Times colour supplement about 4 weeks before I started teaching. And what would be normally the humble role of the assistant to the fifth-year master, a lowly job, a humble job, some sort of useful person. No, I was that fuckface who'd done this ridiculous scheme, you know. And I'd been told afterwards by various people who were in the year, who became friends of mine, they said, we thought, God, do we have to do that? Who is this Wally? And in fact, of course, what happened was in that first year of teaching, not only did my boss have a nervous breakdown, leaving me in charge of 86 people, 10 of whom were older than me, but it meant that I hardly did any drawing of my own. I became a kind of dreaded amateur psychologist, which I have probably remained, hence my words upstairs. Well, there were many, many Archigram schemes. Ron Heron and I were in Los Angeles. He did an instant city which was based on freeways in Santa Monica. I did, though I was sitting in Santa Monica, I was doing a picture of an instant city in England. And in fact, the stuff that I was looking at down the street was the same sort of ticky-tacky that was somehow being incorporated into one's own projects. I move on now very quickly to a kind of category which I have played with. Now, I know I'm in a city that has some towers. I have never been asked to do a tower, but I've done some towers. Maybe one day, before it's too late, somebody will ask me. But I've used towers right from the point of that early Montreal Tower project onwards, and I particularly apply them to places that I have been in. I have a funny rule to myself. If I've been somewhere for more than a month, I feel qualified to comment back to the town that I've been in and suggest how a tower could emanate from it. I've been in Oslo far more than a month on several occasions. I was guest professor there twice and stay there quite often. And at the time, when I did this in '84, Oslo had virtually no high-rises. And I was fascinated by that phenomenon in Nordic cities, particularly around the period of the 1920s, where the cheap electricity and the dark nights combine in the placement of lanterns, usually above sort of fascia height, along the inner town streets in Stockholm, in Oslo, and various other places. I was fascinated by the lantern, and I drew an analogy between the lantern and the oriel window, the corner window, the bay window. And if you look at the tower, you see that it starts at the lower levels with lanterns, as you have them in Oslo. Then the lantern becomes a little sort of peep-out window. Then that becomes a bay window. Then as you go up the tower, the window is the whole room. As you go further up the tower, the window is the whole apartment. And finally, at the top of the tower, the whole thing is a lantern. But in the daytime, there was another conversation going on, because I was fascinated by the sort of coloration that a lot of the modernists, the funkist architects had done, which I discovered was based upon the work of many Norwegian landscape painters, which in turn was in fact based upon the coloration that you get up on the plateau inland from Oslo. And so I was fascinated to say in the night it is a lantern. In the daytime it is in a sense quoting some of the tradition of the place. In other words, without being, I don't think I've ever been consciously a kind of locationist or whatever the word is, but in a way sometimes one is. I found myself in Brisbane, also in the 1980s, a couple of years later, as a guest professor. We're doing a workshop. In that case, it was a a 1-month workshop. And I did a naughty thing, which was to do the project myself in Britt Anderson's house, which I was borrowing, and quietly did the project myself. And I did a sort of contrast of towers there. The one tower on the left, which looks as if it might have been Norman Foster at an early moment, and the tower on the right, which was actually based upon looking and travelling around the Brisbane bungalows, those funny Brisbane houses that are lifted up on legs to avoid the bugs, and were initially using cast iron imported from the UK, and then I think local cast iron. In other words, the bungalow with the veranda, the natural ventilation running across it. And I said to myself, why can't one simply put bungalow on bungalow on bungalow on bungalow? And that's really what the right-hand tower is doing. Now, I have a wife who comes from Tel Aviv, and so therefore, I've been to Tel Aviv many times. Again, nobody has asked me to build a tower in Tel Aviv. There are many towers going up at the moment, but I took it upon myself to do one tower, which was in a sense looking at the business of isolation of the office from the ground, and also the idea of sun shading, so that this tower on the right there is actually based upon the idea of 3 or 4 or 5 skins that can be folded and move with the track of the sun. Many other towers, a tower for Paris on the left, the cheekiness of the Englishman doing a tower for Paris, suggesting that they might have pocket gardens as you move up the tower, I think is not a particularly French idea. In the middle for London, located in Hampstead, and using the idea of collecting water and trickling the water slowly down the side of the tower. It's damp, therefore it's Hampstead, therefore it's Dampstead. Sorry about that. And again in Tel Aviv, in another location, which you can see in the map there, was actually a location laid out or suggested in the way that he used to travel from town to town by Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn suggested that there should be a ring of houses around the edge of this circle. He got the other blokes to actually design them, but he suggested the idea, and then said there should be 3 towers in the center. Now, 50, 60, whatever it is, years later, the 3 towers have never been placed there. I had the audacity to suggest that I could make 3 towers, a pink one which recedes there, which is a housing tower, a right-hand tower, which is simply for parking, it's a car park silo, and the middle one, which is an entrepreneurial tower, because in my observation, I'm a non-Jew married to a lovely Israeli lady, and it's very interesting looking at a culture from slightly sideways on, where Tel Aviv at best depends upon entrepreneurial activity. And so this is a building designed for various types of entrepreneurship to articulate themselves as pieces of building. I've always been fascinated by vegetation, not necessarily as a sort of purist veggie person, but I'm interested in the fact that man can never quite control vegetation, and yet it could be a wonderful architectural device. I'm fascinated by this Würzburg garden because it's a series of striations of different kinds of vegetation. In some, the vegetation is more controlled, in some it's pattern making, in some it is shelter, but they run one after the other after the other. On the other hand, this is a very English condition, which fascinates me intellectually because it suggests in the foreground that man is totally in control, the topiary is well placed. In the middle ground, it is still circumspect, it is still well placed, but in the distance, spookies. What's going on in the distance? Who knows? What might be going on? Gavin and I did a project in the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale about 3 biennales ago, where we took a piece of East London and suggested all sorts of drapes of vegetation could be made. And in detail, some of those drapes of vegetation were drapes upon the housing. Some of them were for growing things. Some were in the tradition of the allotments. Some were in the tradition of hydroponics. Some were in fact inspired by some vineyards that I saw in Bad Kreuznach in Germany, where they hang the plantations very high into the air. Again in Germany, one often goes around giving lectures and somebody comes up to you at the end and says, "There's something like your thing just down the road." I love that. I hope there's somebody going to be here tonight who says, "One of your things is just down the road." And then you build up a kind of vocabulary which is in excess of what you could discover just by going on Wikipedia. The orangery at Schloss Karlsruhe was in fact designed as a room that would never have cover. It was intended to be a place where the growers would create the space. But you don't have to go all the way to Germany. If you go down the road here to Brighton with Tom and Justina, there's a very useful bit of hedge cantilever work, which will now join my collection. In my own work, of course, I've been fascinated by the notion that the vegetation can be an element of the architectural partie, that it can be woven in. And we actually got planning permission for this particular building till the bottom dropped out of the Spanish economy. And unfortunately, Messrs. Herzog and de Meuron got theirs done. So everybody, if you say veg on the wall in Madrid, they say, oh yes, Herzog and de Meuron. We were there too, may be noted. The word metamorphosis has been central to a lot of what I've been doing. And right from early days, this is a sort of flick of the wrist project that I did in the 60s, which was for a village that would be a hovercraft that would move, that would then pump itself up and stop with an inflatable. Many years later, as the humble professor in a German art academy, I and my friend Christine had the opportunity to fill in a little courtyard. We knew the building well. I was in fact doing a job for my colleagues, always a very dangerous thing to do, in case it leaks. It did leak, but only a little bit. What did it do? It filled in a courtyard and flapped open when it got hot and flapped shut when it got cold. There's a wonderful engineer who I worked with on that occasion called Klaus Bollinger. And I'm delighted to say that he was the engineer for the Graz Kunsthaus, and he's the engineer on the last competition project that we've just handed in. There are many metamorphic projects that I've done. This is an elaborate one called Way Out West Berlin, which was a kind of pun on the westness of the project and the Berlinness of the project, and also the idea of the Wild West, so that the cactus became a part of the architectural language. You just have to take that on board. It's a quick lecture. It needs a bit of explaining, I know. And it ends up looking somewhat like that. Probably a more developed project, but later project, is, of course, Veg House. I like calling it veg rather than vegetated, because it's like meat and two veg. It's a sort of casual thing. The Veg House starts off as a triangulated enclosure with car parking, a bedroom, some electrical equipment, and a little bit of armatures so that things can grow. And then they do grow, and they get more, and the pieces move, and they do grow, and they become more spooky, more almost Victorian in their word references. And of course, a lot of those spidery things are mixtures of high-tech equipment, air supply, growies, hi-fi, all sorts of things mixed in. I love the idea of hi-fi being part of a thing that's growing grapes, for example. If you get your head around that, you can certainly draw it. And then the project moves forward, and it moves to version 6, at which point you say, fuck, it can't go any further. The thing has taken off into the unknown. And you stop the project. Otherwise, you go mad. Having done a vegetated house, though, it suggests that what happens if you have a village of such things? You might have a kind of suppurating series of enclosures, not all of them triangle in this case, and that they're changing and moving and drifting and melting and soaking at different stages. Being a kind of, I've always regarded myself as a joke academic. I suppose when you get more than 3 professorships, you have to lie back and say, perhaps I'm a sort of academic, really. But invited to Rice University once, I was doing a series of seminars on urbanism. And one day, you know, like people do, they said, what do you think of Houston? And as a reply, in the 3-week gap between my then and my next visit, I started doing a scheme called Super Houston. Don will know this town, of course. My Super Houston tried to go further than Houston could ever go by bugging the roads, having vehicles that would use the computer to arrive at the front door. So you'd get in your car, switch on the bug, go to sleep, play cards, read the newspaper, watch TV, and then beep, 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 beep. You'd take over the wheel and say, "Hey, Uncle George, great to see you. Wow." In other words, it would be a mixture of Houston as we know it now, a city largely under trees, and something else. And the something else would involve buildings. The larger buildings would be rather like billboards. They would be billboards, which would each group of them announcing another piece of the town, but also the billboards containing normal building functions. Much more recently, we took another completely different scenario, which was the sort of Armageddon scenario of what might happen to that same piece of East London that Gavin and I played with. What would happen if the floods really do come? Not a high-tech solution, a kind of crap-tech solution, sort of people gathering together bits of driftwood and whatever was left of their civilization, climbing up inside these kind of almost evacuated tree trunk structures, floating, hopefully, kites that might catch some rain, and building inside this curious structure. Of course, general preoccupations such as growing vegetation up the side of things obtain. It is in a funny way in the tradition of Archigram, but not looking like it. Sometimes we got very near to making a building that used the same thinking. This is another project for Spain. We won the competition just at the time when the bottom ran out of the Spanish economy. More recently, I've been interested in the grain of vegetation again, and allying it with the notion that perhaps this is a hypothetical project, as many of them are, but it is an imagined landscape where you can see inserted within the landscape certain drifts of constructed objects. But the constructed objects are the clear ones, the blue ones and some sort of clown-like ones. But then if you look at the vegetation itself, I deliberately posit the fact that perhaps some of those pieces of vegetation themselves are structures, or even are quasi-architecture. I deliberately put a series of ambiguous elements in, which might be interpreted as architecture, might be interpreted as vegetation, or some kind of strange morph of the two. A short digression, which I think is necessary to give. I ask you this question. I move in academic circles. There are many, even talented people who don't believe, can't bring themselves to smile. I was in Santa Monica one morning, my favorite other city, and man had a soft toy animal on his head. It was 7 o'clock. I immediately rushed back to the hotel and emailed my friend Marian Coletti, because as a student, he had done a project with animals on his head. And he immediately emailed back and said, "There's a third guy I know about." Now, I have to point out that Marian Coletti is Dr. Professor Marian Coletti. This project, and my wife Yael was his tutor, this project led in a roundabout way directly to his eventual thesis. And the work that he does now is the stuff below there. He oscillates between the University of Innsbruck and the Bartlett. But if that can start with animals on the head, why not? I, after all, have a background of loopy stuff. As I say here in my black hair period, I did Infogonks, which was meant to be a university that would probably drive you blind, but would connect with the world. I was giving a lecture in Vienna, as one does, and a delightful young lady came up to me at the end of the lecture and said, "You must go to Schlugenstrasse," or whatever, number 43. I thought it was a sort of invitation In fact, it was an invitation to look at a shop window in which there was sausage model urbanism. Never be surprised by sausage model urbanism, but never be surprised by large sausages, even in Oslo, done by a great guy called Magnus Viggin. It's a temporary museum. And after all, I have a certain legitimacy in funny, nasty shapes myself. I like things like the fact that Mike Webb, visiting the University of Manitoba, was sitting in an aeroplane which happened to be in the library. Why not? After all, I think you've had C.J. Lim in town recently, and C.J. is another person who is a fantastic aficionado of the work of Heath Robinson. I would posit the notion that Heath Robinson is really the originator of the British high-tech moment. But I would need another hour to explain why. Of course, it's not the prerogative of the English entirely. We were in Valparaiso, Chile, recently, and we'd just come up the top of one of those cranky lifts they have there, and I was, as I have a habit of doing, I was photographing a kiosk. And the bloke inside the kiosk noticed this and then cooperated by bringing his dog from underneath the counter and placing the dog so that it would look as if the dog was operating the kiosk. He got it. He knew. He was one of us. I find myself with a predilection for noses. Now, I'm sure a psychologist would have a wonderful time with that. And maybe if there's a psychologist in the room, they'll whisper quietly in my ear what this is representing. But I do seem to like noses, and I'm lucky enough at the moment we're actually building some noses. That was why the title of the lecture had nose in it. I'm fascinated by kiosks. I think that they tell you a lot about the scene. A Brighton kiosk isn't as interesting as a London kiosk. The London kiosk can be virtually the Archigram object, the mobile element that can expand its enclosure, it's technologic, it's there, and it has coffee. And it tells you about a culture. The Swedish are very sensible. They're very reasonable, very dull. Look at the kiosk. Whereas in Vienna, they are making with the big sausage. Natürlich. In Bremen, in northern Germany, they also have some big sausage, but it is a little bit more controlled. And in Los Angeles, they have nearly as many fatzos as you have in Melbourne. And they have a big fat truck. But in New York, it's hard and mean and tight. You better watch your wallet. Whereas in Brisbane, it's expansive. I don't know what to make of Melbourne yet. But I give my next lecture next Tuesday in Tokyo. I will have had it sorted out in my head, and this will have probably a different caption. But I want to talk about what we assume of cultures. My wife's city is often in the news. Her country is often in the news as a troubled land. Now, the city was developed by that terrible combination of Scottish town planners and German-trained builders. Interesting, lethal combination. But it did have one Germanic feature, which was the boulevards. The standard thing is have the boulevard with the trees, the dogs shitting, the little modernist kiosk at the end, each end of the boulevard. And indeed, you do. Here's a really fantastic guy, has the best juice in the Middle East, and he enjoys his modernist kiosk, and there's always a queue. There's never not a queue. Frankfurt, Germany, has a calm history of the last 50 or more years. Has a boulevard, Holbeinstrasse, with the trees, same dogs shitting, same trees, same rounded cornered modernist kiosk at the end of the boulevard. But it's miserable. There's some poor old guy farting there, and there's a sad Turk inside who just about sells you a bottle of milk. We've had our sorties into the world of designing kiosks. This is a competition that we got into the final of, and then they kind of abandoned it. leaving us trailing, but loving the idea of the kiosk, or across the boardwalk, which has been a centre point for many projects that I've worked on. The idea of the boardwalk that can lock into and under the legs of the buildings. The boardwalk that can turn into a natural, it's automatically doing its own thing, it can turn into a natural place for the flaneur. And in Gold Coast, we are also interested in the possibility of the boardwalk. And we discovered a little outfit run by very young people called Rabbit and Cocoon, which is already doing some of the things that we talk about in the boardwalk. There is human life in Gold Coast. But my favorite of our projects for this was a competition project we did for Skopje, for a footbridge. They simply wanted a footbridge to link the shopping centre across the river to the shopping centre in the middle of town. In Crab, we said, hey, that's a nice little one. And then I said, yeah, footbridge, just a footbridge. How about a kiosk? Of course. Then Gavin said, hey, how's about we make the kiosk move? Then I said, hey, how's about we make the kiosk have a bar on top of it that has steps that come down, like at the back of some airplanes, so that after 7 o'clock at night, you can have a sliver bit, enjoy the view of the river, and the kids can still have their chalk ices from underneath. And of course, we didn't win the competition. In fact, a bloke at the back of a lecture I gave somewhere said, I am from the town. They made a concrete footbridge. I thought, I know they're going to make it. Of course, I could have told you. We are mad. I think that's one of our best schemes, and I offer it to any town that has the will to cross a bridge creatively. You don't even have to have the river. I mean, you could just have the thing with the... In fact, maybe you don't even need the curl. You just have the bar, you know. It's a question where you cut that. Yes, of course, we do naughty things with places. We take a calm, absorptive European city, and I think many of you know what's coming next. The city, if you look just at this view of it, has already some weird shit going on. There's these baroque minarets and so on. And then if you go down a little unsuspecting side street, you find there's a sort of bum sticking out from the street. And in fact, the lad rests there like a dog. I think it's like a dog in a basket. It is of the scale of the town. It just happens to look a bit different. It's a very simple scheme. And I think one of the reasons we won the competition was that we were actually simpler than many of the very complicated schemes that some wonderful people did. It is a pin and a skin. And you go up the pin, and suddenly something is theatrically revealed to you. They're the people going up the travelator, leaving the cafe behind, arriving, bursting into the unknown. The organization took the form of the site, where you see on the left-hand side the old iron building, behind it a couple of second-rate sort of baroque houses, and then a piece of site. And all we did was effectively to go to... We squirted the building into the available bit of site and stuck the pin up it, I mean, so to speak. And that's all it really does. I mean, the rest is noise, you know. And of course, we had to respect the culture, we had to respect the local culture, the existing buildings. We had to honor the indigenous building. Until we found out that that metal building was stuff brought in from Sheffield. It had been, so there were some loony British who sort of sold them this metal stuff in the middle of the 19th century, and some loony British who sold them this plastic stuff at the end of the 20th century. So much for indigenous culture. It was a project in which Colin and I were able to incorporate a lot of, keeps doing this, was able to incorporate a lot of intriguing things, such as the notion of melting the skin from the transparent through the translucent to the solid and back again. But in a way, the project is as much a craft object as the roof next to it. It's still a series of pieces stuck together and put around an armature. Without the computer, it could not have happened. And one wonders, one speculates as to what of the earlier Archigram oeuvre could have been made possible if it had been differently timed. The actual thing reflects the city. It also, of course, has a system of nozzles which bring in north light, except for this nozzle, which is the naughty nozzle. And he doesn't poke north, he looks sort of over there, because he looks at the castle. And you get, it's a repeat of something we did in Archigram times in the Living City exhibition, where Mike Webb made a series of periscopes that looked out of the window, out of the cocoon, down the street, and people queued up to look at London buses. They'd come in a bus, but once you deny them the bus, they look at the bus. So 30-odd years later, I just dug out from the back pocket the same trick. They look at the car, they queue up to look at the bloody castle. You can't avoid the damn thing, it's up there for all to see. But as soon as you're in the cocoon, you queue up to look at it. It says something about the tradition of theatre, perhaps, or denial, or again, psychologists had a lot of fun with that. It's not a high-tech building. It is a crap-tech building. It was not remotely within the budget for a high-tech building. And I think due to Klaus Bollinger's cleverness, it was possible to do within a normal museum budget. The section exposes the fact there's a lot of car parking. The interior exposes the fact that you have to put in a series of substructures for special exhibitions. And of course, the 920 pixels of light that ride the body. They're not just in a sort of box of lights. They ride the body, enable the thing to respond to the city, to be the plaything of a number of artists and designers and filmmakers even. It is a filmic building. The thing that really resides with me is the parts that one didn't plan for, the interstitial spaces, which often, to me, are the most exciting parts of the architecture. And that's something I'm learning late in life, that it is these interstitial conditions that are often the most intriguing. And then there's the cantilevered needle. When I was a student at the A, we used to go and see this special, precious book of Chernikov's 101 Fantasies. It remained in the mind. In Valparaiso, there's also some strange guys who were probably looking at Chernikov's 101 Fantasies. Never be surprised where you find yourself, and there's something that is just down the street that is about your thing. If you photograph it correctly, you see it gently sitting behind the vegetation. But much of the conversation has been about its blobness. Der große Blob. There was even a conference called Blobmeister. Blob and Meister, what a combination. And of course, the journalists loved the notion of the attack of the blobs. We have a serious and legitimate tradition in the United Kingdom, she says archly, of blobs. We have the wonderful 19th century blob, and we have Mr. Blobby. And such things seem to attract somebody, because the Austrians have made 2 postage stamps with our blob on it. Presumably the postmark is just an additional amusement. I now move on to the second. I'm trailing by 3 minutes on my schedule. I move to the second part of the lecture, which is no more serious. Oh, here we are. We sometimes like doing blue buildings. Our very first blue building was the one I did for social housing, small piece of social housing in Berlin. Now, you remember that project that I said about the legs with the boardwalk running under it. That Pinto project, which was a master plan, never saw the light of day. But a commission did come from the EMVS, the people who do social housing in the city of Madrid. And in fact, it was a requotation of some of the ideas from the Pinto project. The idea of lifting the housing above the ground, putting the public doing naughty things under the housing. And in fact, in the original version, there would be sports facilities on the top, kiosks at the bottom, not kiosks designed by us. They should be designed by anybody who can just stick a bit of wood together. And in fact, what happened was that the building reached the third floor and just sat there for more than a year. The economy had collapsed in Spain. It looked for a long time as if the building would never be completed. It has been completed, and it has 100 happy families, hopefully, living in it. Nobody can afford to open the kiosks, and the sports facilities were eliminated. The blueness is not quite as blue as we would wish, but the building is there, and the apartments, I think, are quite elegant in their way. And it reminds one that when you strip off all, and the real nice thing that wasn't done were the shutters, which were very special and would have been slightly mechanical objects on the outside. What has remained, what is weird, is that some of those old sort of, God help us, Corbusian values have remained, and that's a puzzlement for me. It's probably its best part of the light cores, which are very large and slightly sculptured. We do coloured projects. We like colour. This is a project for Birmingham New Street Station where we would take each of the faces of, it was a wrap of the station. It's not to redesign the station, but simply wrap it. Alessandro Zappolo has actually won the competition. Our colours would have each faced a different part of the city. The red-coloured street would be faced by a red thing. Jan Kaplitz's blue building would be faced by the blue thing. The south would have the pale part, which is quite convenient, reflecting the sun. And then the green would be the other bit. And we loved this project, and we made very large models of it. We almost knitted it together by almost doing a kind of couture operation, though there were proper drawings as well. Another coloured project which didn't win the competition was for Taipei Music Strip, which was then playing 2 games. It's a very, very long site, and it's a series of music houses and a pathway and some gardening. At the city side, one chose to make the architecture quite hard, almost de steel. And at the countryside end, it flops into a roundness. But the colours are also doing something. It starts to be multicoloured at the city end and becomes monochrome. So as the buildings become more fruity, the colour drops away. It's a way of, it's a kind of analogous to a kind of musical counterpoint, I think. Other projects have experimented with exploding into space, but keeping colour as the maintainer. Other projects, back to towers again. This is a more recent one for Swiss Cottage, which is the area where I live in London. I think I've lived there more than a month, so I feel legitimized in doing this project, which is looking at comparative surfaces and materials with vegetation offered as merely one of several surfaces. But sometimes we do black. We did black for a very Baltic project, a project in Rakvere, which is in Estonia. It's windswept, it's cold. There is a tradition of tar and ships. And it was that which caused us to look at the possibility of a black building. But in Italy, in northern Italy, we did a theatre and won the competition. It's actually, from Crab Times, one of our favourite projects. But it is Italy, and the mayor got booted out, and the project collapsed. But it is still one of our favourite projects. You can see the building somewhere there of the same coloration. It's a town that has a tradition of terracotta. It's a town that has a series of open spaces, and the parts of the theatre were very carefully tuned so that they would pick up connecting lines between different parts of the old town. And alongside is the market. We deliberately encourage the market to be part of the building. In fact, you know, I think that theatre in a small town isn't a question of sort of, well, it's partly a question of who you see with a glass of wine in your hand, and then, you know, you go to sleep when the performance comes on. But the other thing is that theatre can occur almost anywhere. And what you're providing is a piece of town that, especially if you provide some liquor and some coffee and some places to shelter, a part of the marketplace that you drag up onto the theatre. And it was quite a detailed project with and the little house on the right-hand side is a very important house to the then mayor who got booted out. It was, in fact, the trade union house, and it was symbolic that the project would incorporate the house of the trade union, and we suggested that it could be the gallery element and would be a kind of marker, like almost a gatehouse to the line of the theatre as a whole. It had quite a lot of parametric modelling involved in its creation. That is something that Gavin is very capable of. It also had a glance back to an earlier project that I did with Christine Hall, which is also a public project in a small town. This was our stained glass museum, which again involves in the very careful positioning of small elements vis-a-vis the ramshackle nature of the back of the building and the rather formal nature of the front of the building. This is our sort of touchy-feely territory, which we enjoy as an adjunct to stuff like this, perhaps, which was a series of competitions in Taiwan for the notion of a pylon tower that would be involved in the creation of energy, mainly through growing algae. I refer back to the 1963 building because it is again an armature, the notion of the tower as armature from which you hang various elements. In this case, the algae were grown in big sort of sacks, almost sort of latex holders. The second project investigates more fully the actual apparatus of the business of growing algae and places the algae as a series of trays. And the third project, realizing that there's a limited amount of algae that you can produce on such a tower, looks at combining the algae growing with wind farming, with water husbandry, and other forms of alternative energy collecting, and pulls that all together by using a series of panels. And then it trickles down over the park, which sits underneath it. There's a model. There was a nighttime project done by our friends, Jason Bruges company. And then the armature is used to house a whole series of wedding halls, laboratories, growing platforms, and so on. And these are woven into the progression of the tower, almost nesting in amongst the panels. As I say, it drops down into the park, trickles. Vienna, a competition for 5 new buildings. We won our competition, it's a 3-stager. And I did some cartoons at the beginning of the project, which was my idea of cheerful and perverse Vienna. I like to suggest that perhaps even in an academic institution, you could have some of these going on. And we didn't lose the competition. It is our largest project so far. It's 270 meters long. It's 2 buildings. The law faculty, which is mainly a research faculty, and the central administration for the university. We use what we call sunshine corners. We were interested in pulling the light into the body of what is a large building. And we were interested, again, this term nooks and crannies, we're interested in territories which are not just restricted to the curriculum activities or the interlocutory activities. We're interested in the spaces in corridors. We pull and push. We have the sunshine corners, and we pull and push the circulation areas. We pull and push the terraces. We encourage people up onto the building and around it, into the crevices of it. I'm pleased to show that, in fact, the building is nearly finished. It is coloured. It's very coloured. All the other buildings, the Zaha one, the Hitoshiabe one, the one done by the various Spanish people, sorry, my brain's gone, are very grey and white. Ours is coloured. Otto Wagner did some coloured buildings. Didn't always do coloured buildings, but there is a precedent. It can be very grey. You know, Vienna Space is beautiful cities. Many of the time, I've been many times to Vienna. It's often quite grey. It can get very grey in Vienna. No longer, folk. No longer, not in our building. As you enter the building, on the left-hand side, there is the students' common room, which is a smiling, glassy cheek of a building. And on the right is the coffee shop, which is another smiling cheek. So you enter via these two smiling cheeks. That's the idea. And towards the park, there is a more sort of fruity, suppurating piece of building. We have a system of sunbreakers, and they sometimes get quite complicated and quite interesting. We have a garden that comes up over the library, and with roof lights, not roof lights that you look at the castle anymore. They're roof lights that you can actually sit on. I quite like the idea that you're there looking at some tome and somebody's bum is just above you. Could be quite interesting. We designed it for that. The library is coming, well, the whole building is nearly finished. One of the people on our staff did this rather sexy plan of the library, which shows these pink things, which are little capsules, which are not all going to be pink, they can be various colours, sitting as quiet spaces you can disappear into in the library, and each of those has a sit-on roof light above it. So the bum condition might be quite particular as you're sitting there having a very, very deep, earnest intellectual conversation. Something sits on top. Why not? It is striped, it is coloured. Darker colours to the ground, lighter colours to the sky. The lino of the we wanted to do it over the whole floor, but we were only allowed to do it down the corridors. The lino of the corridors does the reverse, so that the light rooms have the dark floor, and the dark rooms have the light floor, and the middle has the middle. In Valparaiso, again, it was as if somebody's been reading my letters, except they'd done theirs first. It's extraordinary. You go somewhere very, very distant you never knew about before, and there it is, that stuff, that thing, the coloured. Well, actually, I had done it before, a long time ago. It's what I call, again, back pocket stuff. You have certain ideas, you don't get to do them, you stick them in your back pocket, and then, if you're lucky, sooner or later, it comes out of the pocket saying, maybe we can do it here. We do a lot of competitions, some of them very strange, and they don't win, but they're exciting to do. This is a favourite recent one of mine. We didn't win that one either, which took off on the idea of the cycle, the bicycle, generating the university building. That you'd always have this dynamic of people cycling down and rotating around a pond which would be icy in the winter because it's in a northern place. And that would, in a sense, be the generator of the project. You will notice from your poster that there's a thing called Comfo Veg. It started off life as a project, the idea of comfort and vegetation. Remember the veg house? It really carries on from the veg house. The idea of comfort, audiovisual equipment, and vegetation as a club. Well, we sort of did it in SciArc in Los Angeles. We did more drawings. We did some computer drawings. We found a way of making this thing out of rubber with a kind of stockinette cover. And there it is, Comfo Veg lives. and was enjoyed for, I think, 2 months. I was even told that very naughty things happened on the Campo Verde, but I don't wish to know. But you can imagine. I offer it to any university that wishes for a new kind of room of retreat. We tried to sell Campo Verde to Bonn, but we'd gone over the budget, and they said that would just break, that would finally, it can be pretty cheap. And I've done a thing I've never had the opportunity of doing before, which is to actually have constructed something that previously I'd done an earlier version of, actually constructed, and then to flip forward to say, right, we've got that bit. Now what could we do with the rest of it? It's an interesting, I've not had the opportunity to do that. We sometimes have funny jollies. This is a series of jollies from last year, a small competition we won for the Peruvians, the kiss tables that my wife Yel and I have done together, and some more sort of comfo material in Tel Aviv. And now, finally, I come to Australia. Queensland, Australia. We won the competition for the architect. Oh, no, I think you know about that sort of stuff here, don't you, doing architecture schools? We won the competition for a much smaller architecture school than yours, of course, and it's in Bond University, which was started off by Arata Isazaki, and is basically, just as Graz was skin and pin, this is scoops and wrap. Now the scoop is a really key generic element. The scoop is, if in Vienna there are these corridors that you sort of disappear into in crevices, the scoop is a formalized crevice. Each scoop different. Each scoop not designated for any particular purpose, but anything that is not on the curriculum. If 3 or 4 people want to have a conversation, a very small crit, a little breakout, or just somewhere to be. And then there are the studios, you can see in the bottom of the drawing. There is the street that runs through, and then there are the more circumspect elements, the staff rooms, the computer research room, various toilets, and a little tiny room at the back there, which is a reading room on each level, which were the rooms that were going to have the miniature Campo Verde. Anyway, can't grumble. It's going up. There you see the scoops in relation to the street. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to digress because, or not digress, but to show another approach that we made. The few cartoons I did for the Vienna project, everybody in the studio said, you must do some cartoons, you must do some cartoons. And I couldn't resist. I did about 6, and they said, you've got to do more. So I did another 6, and they said, no, you've got to do more. I ended up doing 2 dozen. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. But these cartoons suggest that, for me, the designing of an architecture school is, in a sense, not just going to the, you know, the tomes, not going to the metric handbook or the modern equivalents of such things, but to have, after all, 45 or more years of anecdotal experience of the architecture school and all its funny ways. This is a jury where possibly rather pert young faculty says, I question your terms of reference, Barbara. And of course, life imitates art. This is a wrong accent for SIARC, but it's SIARC, where there indeed Barbara is having her terms of reference questioned. This is the fact that it's important to have a circulation system by which things can be observed, but that you don't necessarily interfere. This is something borrowed, actually, because Gavin, who went to 4 schools of architecture, including Harvard and the Bartlett and SIARC and Brighton, and I, who've been to all sorts of art, we have a lot of knowledge of different architectures. You know what they do it so-and-so? That's not a bad idea. And the idea of the upper corridor was based on UCLA, where you can watch the crypt from the corridor above, but you don't have to interfere unless you go down and interfere. Quite a useful, very simple thing to say. So this is somebody that looks suspiciously like Odile Deck as a visitor saying, and saying to the faculty, yeah, they're undoubtedly very bright. This is a little nod in the direction of the visiting fireman. The thought that there might be somebody from Princeton up at Bond is an intriguing one. And, but they won't be back there till the 18th. I think we all know this situation. It's a justification, and you look at the guy, he stands no chance. But he believes that he might. And this is another situation which is really saying it's got to be a building that's available all the time. We've all been there. Things really weren't going very well. This is my own favorite one. The cat and mouse game. You know, one of the first things you do when you're appointed as a professor in the New School of Architecture is to discover, this is from the professor's side, to discover the way you can get out. You see somebody boring coming, how can you avoid them? But of course it's a mouse and cat game, because here's some guy who's, you know, don't forget it's Gold Coast. Kilometres and kilometres of wonderful beaches. Oh, nice to see you in the building again, Jules. Sorry about my non-Australian accent. And the fact that the building, and this is something which we heard third hand about the jury, they liked the project because they could see it had opportunities. Not meaning just for architecture students. It had photo opportunities, event opportunities, the sort of thing that Tom and I have just been doing upstairs would go down, would be much more enjoyable, I think, in our street space than it is in this rather deadly building upstairs, if I may be so bold as to say. Gavin is a wonderful drawer too. He doesn't do cartoons, he does proper drawings that show what people are doing. And this is the assumption that somebody like Zaha might visit, and the faculty lines up under the nose of the building. Oh, I shook her hand, you know, I shook her hand. She said hello, rather like the Queen. But this is also a symbolic one, which I put at the end of the series, because, in fact, even when you win the competition, much of what then happens is tweaking. And much of what happens in a tutorial is tweaking. And much of discussion of a project and of ideas for projects is tweaking, is adjusting and developing. There is a street running down the core of the building, and the street has these folds of scoop around it. As you look down, the scoops change direction slightly, and there are bridges. And in this picture, the studios are on the left. Of course, both Gavin and I love drawing. We do a lot of drawing. But once somebody digs the hole, suddenly the drawing is frozen. But there is still tweaking to be done. We put our best architect lady onto the question of how to manipulate the scoops so that the minimum amount of variation of shuttering could occur. And this was several months of arguing and manipulating and arguing, manipulating, reducing the cost of these idiosyncratic elements, because each scoop is actually different. And we pulled it off, and we found some German sort of patent shuttering, which even the builders in Gold Coast managed to handle rather well, actually. There will be a certain amount of plywood applied. There will be a sort of mystery feel to some of the building. And it sits proudly on the street rises up a small hill, and out saying hello, not this time gleaming cheeks, but a nose. And there is the nose, and the nose lives, despite the efforts of Arabs of Brisbane to stick a fucking great column down the nose like a dribble, but we managed to bully them out of that. It's called a structural upstand, guys. It's really modern. God help us. The north facade was revised. The only bit that was really substantially revised from the competition version. Competition version was far too expensive. This is a cheaper version, which really just uses the idiosyncrasies of sun shading on top of very wide range of window types. These are the holes before they've got the sunshades and the coloration. So there again, we see the system of the building, the scoops, the facade, and the beginnings of the actual furnishing. We're lucky enough to have the contract to supply the furniture, and we have designed our own furniture. We have nearly 300 items of furniture, which we're having made, as I speak, in China, organized through Hong Kong. Many of them are now completed. We're trying as much as we can to have very, very tight quality control, because these pieces of furniture have to fall underneath the normal cost level of Australian academic furniture. And they are. That's why you do it in China, guys. And we're commissioned to do 100 pieces of special furniture in the Vienna building. So suddenly we're in the sort of furniture business. This is the state of play. I'm delighted to say that it looks, this is a smaller building, but it looks as if the two buildings will be almost neck and neck at the end. They'll be both opening officially in October, but actually completed before that. These are more views. This is the sort of systematic cut through the building. This is the other systematic cut through the building. And these are the pieces of furniture. You remember the KISS table? Cousin of the KISS table. There is a color coding by which various types of, and of course there are various interlocking systems, so you can have groups of people, 4 people, 6 people, 2 people, 1 person. And then there's different varieties of furniture for the teaching rooms. We've made models of all the furniture, and on the right-hand side, the first prototypes. But many more have rolled out since this photo was taken. And I can report that that is the state of the building. This is a little bit further back, actually, but it's rising. The concrete work now is pretty much finished. I finished, therefore, with some home pictures. Sometimes the surviving members of Archigram visit Crab. This is Michael Webb drawing an aeroplane, and Gavin Rowbottom waiting to draw another aeroplane. That's what boys do when they meet. They draw aeroplanes. Gav and I enjoy ourselves and sometimes have a party. And sometimes the scoops are discussed, and sometimes visitors come. As much as we can, we don't have a po face. Thank you. More or less on the dot.
Well, Peter, that was truly fantastic. I think he's tricked us, beguiled us, led us down the country path, and delivered us to a point where we'll believe anything you say. I think the statement this evening is quite clear. The impact of Peter's work over many decades is profound. We have digested a lot of what you've said over the years, and yet you continue to discover, to lead, and to reveal the new. So I think we're very privileged this evening to have you here in Melbourne. Thank you very much for coming all the way to Melbourne and for spending 2 weeks with us. I would encourage everyone...
Thank you for having me, mate. Come on.
I would encourage you all to go upstairs and see how the students have interpreted all of this and engaged with it. And we would look forward to seeing you back in Australia at some point, and back in Melbourne at some point.
No worries.
Now he speaks the language. So, thank you very much for coming.